The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining APQC's webinar, Transforming Procurement to Maximize Sustained Value. As a reminder, audio is available through your computer speakers or dial-in lines, and all attendee lines are currently muted. However, if you have questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A tool to your right, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the webinar. We will be sure to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, as we want this to be an interactive webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as this recording within a few days. For now, I would like to take a moment to pass the webinar off to our Senior Principal Research Lead, Marisa Brown, who will be posing some really interesting questions for our speaker throughout the webinar.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you, Michael, for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Michael Van Keulen is a procurement executive with more than 20 years of experience that spans procurement and finance. Most recently, he was at Lululemon, leading the transformation for the past 4.5 years. And I had the pleasure to meet Michael last fall and interview him about what he was accomplishing in procurement, and I know he's an engaging, dynamic speaker. So I look forward to turning it over to him for about 30 minutes or so, and then, as Anna said, please do submit your questions, and we will cover those at the end of the call. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michael to provide some food for thought related to procurement. Michael?
Thank you. No pressure, Anna. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to just provide some perspective on procurement transformation and talk about a few different topics around that, and then hopefully at the back end get some really rich Q&A. So let's get going. So as I get started, I think a good starting point is always to just ground ourselves. I recognize we have an esteemed audience of professionals in different industries and different maturities when it comes to the procurement process. And so what I love about this slide here is that it really articulates the different levels of procurement. And again, everybody will be in a slightly different way of maturity here. And so when I joined at Lululemon, just to kind of give you some context, when I came in, we were very much a level 1 procurement organization, very tactical, very operational and tactical in nature, cutting purchase orders. It's kind of what I would refer to as almost like a PO factory. And then slowly, as you start to mature as an organization, as a procurement function, you start to do more, competitive RFPs. You start to really think about your spending and where does the money go and what are we buying and who we buy from and how much we're buying. And you really start to do that. And that's more like a level 2 where you start to really managing your spend. And then as you mature, you start to just think more about supplier collaboration. And then ultimately the holy grail is obviously to be, that very innovative, forward-looking organization that really supports the strategic vision of the company. So this is really what I love is to do this as a grounding of that whole process. So if we move to the next slide, establishing some operating principles, and we're going to talk a little bit about operating model that comes with that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all, but I do love to touch around like what should an operating model look like. And obviously they do need to include things like fact-based decision making, using real analytics, providing options and transparency to leadership. Like here are some award options that you could think about, or here is where the market is going. Here's where certain raw materials are going, and here is how that's going to influence the overall competitive landscape of your spending. Transparency and engagement. You definitely want to be at the forefront of that. Planning, demand planning is a massive opportunity as well. And I think the last one, and they're in no particular order, I always say, like, if people ask me, like, Michael, what are you bringing to the table? A lot of procurement organizations are very typically saying, well, we are here to save money. And I say, no, that's not my reason of existence. It's creating value, and one of which could be reducing costs, but it could also be mitigate risk. It could be provide higher transparency. It could be innovation. It could be better quality. It could be a whole bunch of different things, payment terms, cash flow. So I just always want to emphasize that procurement is not just there to save money. If we then move to the next slide, This is an operating model that I really, really like. And the reason why I like it, it's what I call activity-based. So, there's some traditional ways where you're more category-based. You got an IT category manager and a logistics category manager. I think we're slowly evolving to this more a model like this, where you have some distinct areas of the procurement cycle managed by a subset of people. So when you look at this model, the strategic sourcing element, that's of course where we do the 7 steps, and I'll talk about it in a second, or the 5-step procurement process, and you run RFPs and you do negotiation, and the skill sets that are required there are very, very different than when you talk about vendor management and collaboration, and where that EQ becomes really important. And that's really something that we're seeking today in procurement as well, and that highly collaborative approach. And then, and if we could just flip back to the previous slide just for one more second. Then you have the strategic side, which the strategy is really about best practices, and I'll talk about the digitization. I mean, that really falls into that area. And then the buy desk is still that, that highly operational technical buying that does happen. And then, so yeah, if you then go to the next slide, thank you. So how do you really determine? It all depends on your organizational structure. Are you geographical? Are you business unit driven? Are you very centralized? Are you decentralized? The key, in my opinion, is you want to make sure that you support the strategy. You want to support the stakeholders. You want to feel like you're a real business partner to them. You're not a hurdle. Like what you hear often is, oh, procurement is slow, it's clunky, they slow down my process, they're just here to cut costs. No, we're here to execute strategy. We're here to support acceleration of that strategy. And that's, I think, is what's important as you think about your own organizations and about your own design. I think that is really what is fundamental. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about category management. And why category management is so important. So if we move to the next slide, it is a methodology and it's a mindset, and it's what we do. That's what procurement does. We manage spend, we manage categories, and if you look at slide number 10, that's really this just gives you the different components of category management. It is a methodical approach. I always say I can teach this to anybody who is interested, and it's a matter of how do you extract sustainable value from the spending that you have in your organization. It starts with what are you trying to accomplish. So the first pillar here, the strategy and the planning, that's all about what's the strategy, what's the company trying to accomplish. Then the second element of that is, how can I formulate that into a procurement sourcing strategy, right? Like how do I, and I'll talk about that in just a second. How do I formulate what it is that I'm about to go buy, and where am I going to buy it from, and what's the performance of my suppliers, and how do I collaborate? And there's a bunch of different things around that. But then you need to also think about that once you have that supplier in your ecosystem, what's the life cycle, and what's the life cycle of the contract? What risk will I potentially have, and what can I do to mitigate that risk? A really crucial component of what procurement brings to the table. And then the last element is, of course, that collaborative approach that I talked about earlier. That is what procurement brings to the table. It combines suppliers with strategy and really trying to bring that together in a value-driven type of way. Then at the next slide really talks about the 7-step, and some people apply a 5-step or a 3-step. So I don't really want to say like it has to be 7 steps, but these are typically the components of a strategic sourcing process. And as we think about that, it all starts with setting up a proper assessment of collecting the data, right? Like what are you buying, who you're buying it from today? Yeah, what is today your ecosystem? Once you have that, then you can really start developing a baseline. And a baseline is really important because procurement uses that typically to determine, what value are we about to deliver. And that could be, again, cost reduction. It could be more quality. It could be risk mitigation. There's a bunch of different things, but setting up a really proper baseline and having that signed off is pretty crucial. Then, of course, you're going to start thinking about the outside world. Like, who do I invite for this sourcing event? How do I formulate an RFP? This is where all of that RFP work happens, or an RFI or RFQ, depending on how you want to go to market with whatever it is that you're about to go procure. And that's when the first gate review happens. And that's a really important step, because what you do there is you go back to your internal stakeholder and say, hey, here is what I think we're going to be buying. And here is what I think we're going to be doing over the next 1, 2, 3 years. Have I embedded the strategy? Do I realize that what I'm about to buy is global, but today it's just North America? Or is it, you know, we are about to double the size of our business in the next 3 years? Well, let's make sure we pick suppliers that actually are able to help us execute that strategy. So it's really important that both, this is where the internal and the external world really comes together. Once there is sign off in that first gate review, if you will, you go ahead and execute your sourcing event. You do your typical, you know, you collect the bid responses, you analyze them, you start doing some form of negotiation. And then you'll end up with some recommendations, and there could be multiple recommendations you take back to the business. It could be a single award, it could be awarding it to 3 different suppliers, and procurement is there to provide recommendations. But I always say procurement does not have the D of decision. That always lies with the business, because it's not my supplier, it's the stakeholder supplier. And so that gate review 2 is seeking alignment with cross-functional partners on who we are going to award that contract to. It's a very important step in the process. Then step 6 and 7 are about awarding that contract, of course, signing that contract, properly storing that contract, and now managing that contract. And managing that contract is critical, and is not always done properly. I admit that I have struggled with that myself. It's kind of like what I'd say referred to as marriage, right? Like once you're married, the journey starts. Once that contract is signed, the journey starts. It doesn't end. And so you want to do some really good vendor management. You want to make sure that KPIs are met, both internally and externally. You want to manage maybe volume rebates or some discounts that you've negotiated. But you also want to make sure that you know when that contract terminates, and there is a start and an end date. And if it requires 6 months for a competitive RFP and potential change, then you want to make sure that you start 6 months ahead of time and not realize 3 months ahead of time, oh, I'm about to actually be out of contract, because that might actually impact potentially your competitive position. So really important as well. So if we move to the next slide, I want to take the bridge and talk about the digitization. At Lululemon, we implemented Coupa. We did that, and it's, you know, this is not a Coupa sales pitch, but that's just one of the source-to-pay solution providers out there. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because obviously we all talk about the digitization of the procurement process, and I felt it's a pretty rich and interesting topic for this audience. And we can all talk about the digitization of the procurement process, and we can Google it, and we will find that basically what it says, it talks about automating the procurement process by utilizing the power of technology. AI, RPA, I mean, all those things are buzzwords, but studies show that only 30% of digitized procurement transformations are successful, and they really deliver what it said it was going to deliver when you started the journey. And so that's really interesting that 70% either fail or don't deliver the value. And there is a lot of studies out there. McKinsey has done studies around this as well. And it's just a really interesting stat. And so, you know, what I'm going to try to do is really bridge that, you know, like that the different levels in procurement. When is it the right time? Because that is, I think, the trigger is when is it the right time to introduce digitization of the procurement process? Don't automate a flawed process. So you really want to go through that journey. And I believe somewhere between level 2 and level 3 is when it's really time to think about the digitization of the procurement process. Equally important are things like, you know, do you have the right leadership in place? Do you have the right support? Do you have the right stakeholder support? Do you need to redesign your process potentially? And I'm going to talk about some lessons learned and approaches in a second. How do you manage change? You know, it's a critical factor. And so if we flip to the next slide, and again, we'll take a lot of Q&A, but this is the process that you could adopt if you are about to embark on a journey. I'll happily talk about this more one-on-one if that's relevant. But select a system integrator first. I think that has proven really beneficial. You develop that current to future state blueprint. That's actually going to help you in your change management journey. Then you start to formulate what we typically do, a 7-step process. You run your RFP, you pick the solution that best meets your requirements. And then you need to have that cross-functional group. Like I said just now, making sure that you got cross-functional support is really, really critical. And cross-functional being finance, IT, legal, procurement, obviously, but equally important is the business. And then having really clear roles and responsibilities. Who's responsible for what? What's your operate? What's the governance? What if you need to make a change? How quickly can you make changes to your business plan as you go into the implementation? So I just want to make sure that we stay on track here. So if we go to slide number 15, just really thinking about, okay, well, what selection criteria do you want to pick as you think about digitization of your procurement process, right? Think things like, what's the total cost of ownership? Don't just think about the cost of the platform itself, but, what other cost components are there? Are there one-off costs that I need to make? What integrations do I really need? And think about the user experience. Invite end users. If you think about it, in my at the Lululemon side of the house, you have more than 400 stores. Those stores have lots of churn. So whatever tool you implement in that circumstance needs to be very user friendly. Otherwise, I'm not going to drive adoption. If I don't drive adoption, I'm not going to generate the return on investment that I thought I would. So it's really important that you think about user experience, especially as what we would call the P2P or the downstream procurement. That is something that people are going to adopt and that people are going to use the platform. Your IT architecture, I think, is a no-brainer. But also how you're going to approach the implementation. Are you going one big bang, or are you going to be more agile? And are you going to say, you know what, I'm going to first start with a business unit or with a geographical area or maybe a subset of users, take some of the learnings, and then think about bigger picture. Scalability, global, if that's relevant for your organization, you want to think about that. Can I deploy this thing in China? Can I deploy it in Europe, in Australia, in Africa, like wherever you are? The touchless processing is an important component. Administrative complexity, we all want that to be reduced, so that's definitely a topic. And if you are a public company, I always want to throw in there that compliance is important. So the old SES 70 or the SSAE 16 compliance is just important if you're a public company. Yeah, lessons learned. Create a governance model. I kind of talked about some of these things, so I'm going to try to do this justice. But create a governance model, and that governance model should be cross-functional. It is really, really important that you have all the different stakeholders in that cross-functional group as you think about deploying a technology like this, because it's going to touch everybody in the company. Engage stakeholders, not just at the highest levels, but also at not just at the most senior execs, but across the organization. You want to really have this tool be embraced by as many people as you possibly can. Celebrate early wins. I'd always say procurement very often has the tendency to be kind of like internally focused, but celebrating early wins is actually the way to go. Start with non-sensitive categories. Like as you think about a procurement transformation, I'd say don't start with marketing out of the gate. You probably want to start with some categories that are slightly less sensitive. Office supplies is an easy one, but even things like logistics or IT are typically the ones where you want to get started with. Make sure that spend is contractually available. I've made the mistake where you go after a certain amount of spend, and then you realize that the contract is not up for renewal for another 24 months. I just wasted a lot of time and energy there. And then the last 3 bullets are all around talent, and we're going to talk about talent, and I hope there's going to be some Q&A around that as well. Is making sure you got the right people with the right skill sets, and not just that, but that you also retain that talent as you develop it. As you go through a transformation, you're now going to, you're going to have labor that is more, is higher skilled, is more in demand. So how do you attract that, and how do you retain that? And so training and development is one way. Of course, having very fulfilling roles and jobs and accountabilities, and take away maybe the more transactional, operational nature of procurement is going to help with that as well. But really think about what resource requirements do you have, and what is that going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years as you plan out your transformational journey. Yeah, and then lastly, it's above everything. I always say, be bold. Be bold in terms of how you approach things. Nobody's going to give you that seat at the table. I know within procurement, we always talk about, getting a seat at the table, and I'm not getting a seat at the table. And, I'd say, just own that seat, get the seat. Nobody's going to give it to you. You just need to go grab it yourself. And so I always like to say, be bold, and demonstrate that there's value. The more we are able to articulate it from a procurement perspective, the easier it's going to be, and for people to come to you and say, hey, I'm about to think about whatever idea I have. That's the time where you want to involve procurement, not, hey, I had this idea, I just selected a supplier, here is the contract, can you get me better terms? That's typically not where procurement is going to drive a bunch of value. And so, I'd say be bold, and be aggressive, and own your spot, and be able to articulate what the values that procurement brings to the table. Because if you can't, then all else becomes irrelevant. Yeah, then I wanted to excuse me, as we kind of hopefully prepare for some really good Q&A. What are some of the key talents that are required for procurement professionals in 2020 and beyond? I thought it'd be, as we think about procurement transformation, we talked about that. We talked about the digitization of the procurement process, some of the 7 steps and some of those operating models. I hope that really resonates with everybody. But at the end of the day, it is about, talent. And as you think about how do you support your organization, having the right talent at the right seats is really crucial. And so my perspective on talent is that procurement is still going through, as a profession, through some transformation itself. I think gone are the days where you just need a bunch of hardcore negotiators that beat the supplier on the head and until they cave. I think those days are long behind us. I think you need way more collaboration. You need to really understand the strategy of the company. And through the collaborative approach with your suppliers and your internal stakeholders, you're going to drive way better outcomes. And there are even procurement professionals out there. MGM, the head of procurement there, she's awesome. That really talk about suppliers will in the future pick their customers, and that's highly provocative. But if you look at how millennials run business, that I don't think that is far from the truth. And in fact, I believe that at some point suppliers are going to pick their own customers, and it's through that collaborative approach and through risk and mitigation and sustainability and all those things that are becoming way more important as we speak, that it's going to require an even slightly different skill set than it is today around the EQ and that collaborative approach that I genuinely believe that procurement brings to the table and is able to provide to any organization. And so supplier collaboration is the future. I think AI and RPA are going to at some point take over RFPs and RFQs. Doing bids and buys, I think is table stakes. But driving that level to that level four of procurement is where I believe we're going to go, and that requires a different skill set. And the sooner you focus on that, I think the higher the level of success and the more value you will bring to the table. So yeah, I recognize I can talk about procurement for hours, but I really believe that this is such a great topic to get Q&A that I'm actually happy we even have more time than I thought, where we still have 20 minutes left for Q&A, which is incredible. I do have the tendency to fly through slides and really hope we're going to get some rich Q&A. So with that, I'm just going to pause for a second and see what questions are coming up.
Great. Thank you so very much, Michael. And I just want to say that what you were talking about in terms of the skills needed for the future in procurement and the EQ, that emotional intelligence and collaboration, very closely mirrors the findings from APQC's research that we just wrapped up on future skills needed, which what came out number one was business ethics, followed by communication, both oral and written, stakeholder management, relationship building and management, and critical thinking. Nowhere in the top 10 was procurement or purchase order processing or any of those skills that you talk about being automated away by AI and RPA in the future. So I think that you're right on the money with that. And we do have some questions for you. And so one of the first questions is, can you go back to slide 6, I believe it is, and there were some questions around the model that you showed. So we're going to just go back there. And the question was, is this actually an organization chart for how you see procurement staff best being structured?
That's an awesome question. And I know you have the tendency to really look at this as an org chart, and I probably failed to mention it. It could be. This could formulate your org structure. If you think about org structure, you typically start to think about FTEs. My perspective is that, if you look at procurement as a money manager, roughly the procurement resource investment, so procurement resource investment should roughly be 0.8% of the spend. So if hypothetically you spend $500 million on spending, if that's your total addressable spend, then roughly your procurement organization should be around about $4 million, ballpark, give or take. And then if you think about, what percentage of that headcount should you allocate to what hypothetically this could be an org structure, to the left side, that's where the biggest value is, right? The strategic sourcing and the vendor management, that's where procurement drives value. The right-hand side is typically more tactical, operational in nature. It's a slightly longer answer to a pretty short question. It could be an org structure, but this is not like number of FTEs, right? I mean, this is more here is how you structure your organization. I've got some job descriptions. If anybody wants to see them, I'll happily share around like what would that fit into strategic sourcing versus buy desk. And the point I'm trying to make here is, think about how much resource do you need in terms of dollars, and then start to think about how many people do you typically need. I hope that was helpful.
Great, thank you. Yes. Anna, do we have some additional questions from our audience?
We do indeed. Let me filter through these guys. And guys, continue to submit your questions through the Q&A tool to the right. We're getting some really great questions here. So we just received a few right now. So Michael, how do you continue to develop your procurement team while at the same time going through a transformation?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? When I hire, let me take a step. Let me just give you my hiring philosophy. I don't hire based upon how long somebody has been in procurement. Frankly, I don't really care. What it does bring to the table, of course, is commodity expertise, which I'm not undermining. That is really critical. But I first and foremost hire for attitude. And so when I started, there was quite a lot of churn, frankly, in the organization. And we did hire some people based upon their attitude, but maybe not so much because they had experience, but more because they have that natural desire and natural curiosity. And then as we went through it, we focused a lot on development. So we did have a playbook. We have that I'm more than happy to share. It's a pretty big document, but that really trains people in everybody having the same methodological approach. Because procurement is a methodical approach. It is the 7 steps, as I just articulated. And so really focusing on making sure that everybody has the same modus operandi, if you will. And then think about, in the beginning, I had a more category-based structure. So I had an IT category manager, and a logistics category manager, just to make it simpler and make it a bit more seamless. Once that matures, I think you're ready for the next iteration of that operating model, which is more an activity-based model. But focusing on development and training and making sure that your team develops as you mature along the way, and potentially then, of course, needing to reject the puzzle a little bit is really fundamental. Otherwise, you might end up with a new way of working, but you don't necessarily have the people on the bus. So development is the short answer to that.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Another question that we have is, I'm not the best in technology, and I am a procurement leader. So what's your best advice to a struggling procurement leader who isn't so savvy with technology?
Well, one thing I'd offer is give me a call, and I'll happily give you a bit more depth in terms of the things you need to think about and look at. It's not uncommon. Frankly, I've had the fortune of doing source to pay twice at VF and at Lululemon, so I had to learn myself. The best thing to do is, go into your network, ask me, ask other peers that you know that have gone through this transformation from a digitization standpoint, like how do you drive value and how do you get adoption and all those things that are really relevant and important, and how do you get anybody to listen to you in your organization and say, hey, we are asking for a couple $1 million, and here's why it's relevant, not just for procurement, but also for our business and our future. So that's one way. Have some of these guys come in, pick a Gartner, pull a Gartner, and look at the three on the top right-hand side. You will find iValua, you'll find Ariba, Coupa, SideQuest is a tool, Zycus. Get some of these guys to come in. They will pitch free of charge, and just do your homework. It's no different than if you were to go buy raw materials, right? We all do our homework, and that's what I'd say. Do your due diligence. Again, I'm happy to get on the phone with whomever asked the question to provide my 2 cents. I've spoken a lot about source to pay, and I have a lot of good material around it. But it's no different than if you were to go buy any of your commodities. Do your homework.
Okay, wonderful. All right, and we just had another question just come in. What is one of the better approaches to getting meetings with the decision makers regarding procurement?
Understand what drives them. That's the short answer. That maybe was a little too short, but the sooner you are able to prove to whomever you're talking to that you're there to help them, and it's not to make them look bad, it's to make them look good and make them look better and help them accelerate their strategic vision. The sooner you're able to do that, and you're not there to prove to them that whomever supplier they've been using for the past 5 years is not competitive and maybe is, I don't know, maybe their ownership structure isn't great or they're not in the best financial shape or whatever, the sooner you'll get that buy-in. And that requires EQ, right? And that's why EQ is so important. Building stakeholder relationships. I always say nobody is going to trust me. You earn it. And the sooner you're able to demonstrate that you're not there to prove they're wrong, but to help execute their strategy and potentially faster, the better it is.
Awesome. Okay, Michael, this is a really interesting question. I was just kind of reviewing this one, and it kind of deals with making procurement a career of choice. So first, why do you think so many smart, high-performing employees leave procurement or don't consider it as a career at all?
I think that, there's two ways to that. One, because we are in procurement, we are in high demand in the business, right? Because we get involved with projects and we know the vision of if you do world-class procurement, yeah, you are at the forefront of a lot of that, and you get to work with so many different awesome leaders that if you excel, they want to get you to work in their department. And so you almost become like this very fertile grounds for talent recruitment within your own organization even. So that's one way that I look at that. I think the second thing is we still are not able to articulate that procurement is a career. It's you can't go to procurement school, right? There's no university that I'm aware of that has procure, like your supply chain. You got HR, you got IT, you got finance, you got all these other things, but there are some certifications. So I think we still have a job to do from a procurement profession standpoint. to provide really clear direction when it comes to career and where that career can go. I've been in procurement more than 10 years. I love it. I'll never do anything else. But we need to be able to articulate that to millennials and to younger people that are still like looking around, like, where am I going to go? And I think we haven't done a good job as a profession yet to really provide that. And I think the sooner we do, the sooner we engage with universities and provide them what procurement brings to the table, the more excited people get. If I talk to people about procurement, they're like, wow, I didn't even know you guys were doing all that. You know, risk and I mean, we do so many different things. So I think we need to step up our own game. Is my perspective. Provide clear direction why it's a career and how rewarding that career can be.
Okay, thanks so much, Michael. That was awesome. So this is a personal question from one of our attendees, and this individual is asking, I had a recent interview whereby the hiring manager asked me to explain my demand management philosophy. He didn't really like my answer, so can Michael please explain his approach?
Well, yeah, that's a pretty long answer. Let me see if I can. So when you think about demand management, the first thing you want to do is understand what the true demand is within the business, right? So if you let me take shopping bags as a great example, right? How do I know how many shopping bags I need in a year? And how do I then go back to my supplier and figure out what their capacities are and what their constraints are, and how can I bring supply and demand together, if you will. So I think the first thing you want to do is understand, how much am I buying? And that could be annually, that could be, semi-annually. It depends on the cadence of your POs, if you will. But the first thing you want to do is make sure you understand, like, what's the business saying, what the demand is. And then you want to take that back to your supplier and say, okay, well, here's my demand, and I really need to understand what your capacities are and what your constraints are in capacity. And then you need to think about, do I want to buy 12 months worth of volume and get all of that in my inventory? And now I need to manage that inventory. And what if I change the specifications? Who's going to, end up with that inventory? So you want to think about your agility as well. You want to think about, like, if I commit myself to a certain volume because I can get a really good rate, does that constrain my business? And so you really need to think about, like, the risk, the appetite of risk, what my demand might look like, but also what happens if my demand is not what I project it to be. And so putting that all together and then coming up with, that's where category management really comes into play, in my opinion. And whomever asked this question, I'll be more than happy to do this on a one-on-one basis and really understand what the particular question was, but really making sure that you bring business and supplier together in a as risk mitigated environment as possible, I think is the key. I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we have a question about someone with kind of a regional perspective. And the question is, for lower and middle income countries, LMIC, procurement is considered a dangerous career because SRM and business, I think, evolve, is the question. How would you advise young people to overcome this fear?
Well, I think the fear is that if procurement is not perceived strategic, right? If you don't go through that transformational journey that I talked about earlier, and you remain in a level 1, level 2 type of an environment where all you're doing is, like, either cutting purchase orders and making sure stuff ends up at the right place at the right time, or all you're doing is competitive RFPs, I'd agree then procurement is a very risky career choice. Because at some point you're going to be automated out of a job. That's why I encourage everybody to focus on, innovative, collaborative. That's where the future of procurement is going. And if you are able to get to that level, I don't really see why procurement is a risky career choice. In fact, I see the future leaders of companies coming out of procurement, and that's 5-10 years out, but I don't really see procurement being a risky career choice if you go down that transformative path.
Great, thank you.
Okay, awesome. So it looks like we have time for about 2 more questions, maybe 3, but definitely 2. So one of the questions we just received is, what are the 3 main skills of a purchasing professional, in your opinion?
I'd say EQ. So having the ability to emotionally understand what drives stakeholders, both internal and external, I think is critical. Analytical skills, having the ability to make sense out of a bunch of data in a way that both your stakeholder understands, but it also still means something to, for example, the chief financial officer, is a really critical one. And I'd say entrepreneurial behavior. So in other words, I like procurement professionals that treat almost the resources that they have been given to manage as their own, and really have put on that entrepreneurial hat. I think those are probably the 3 key ones. I think EQ, analytics, and entrepreneurial are the 3 things that I look for in a procurement professional to join my team, if you will, right?
Great.
The rest is teachable.
Sure. So this is great. We've received a couple of questions on this in different forms, but essentially, what certifications would you recommend for a procurement professional?
You're talking to a finance guy. So what has been really favorable for me is that I have a pretty vast and strong finance background. And so I encourage everybody, if you do not have a finance degree, go do something in finance, making sure you understand the P&L, you can do ratios, you understand what resonates with the chief financial officer. You can talk about payback, ROI, investments, CapEx, OpEx, all those things are really relevant for executives. And the sooner you're able to talk that language, the better it is. So I certainly encourage you to do that. And then there is, in every country, there is SCMP, there is, some universities that you can do some certificates in different parts of the world. I certainly would encourage you to do that. But finance is really critical. The sooner you know how to read a P&L and a balance sheet, and how to figure out where value is going to come from, cash flow, and again, like those types of things, I'd say the better it is.
Great. Awesome. And I'd like to thank everyone for submitting your questions to Michael. It looks like we have time for one more question. And I think it's appropriate to end with this question, essentially dealing with the future of procurement. So how do you think procurement can be innovative to stay relevant for the future?
Well, it starts with, having really good stakeholder relationships. So if I have really good relations of trust with executives in cross-functional departments, I'm talking the head of IT and the head of digital and the head of retail and the head of whatever, and understand what drives their agendas and what the company is trying to achieve as a more overarching strategy, the more they will open up to what they're trying to achieve. And the sooner you're in that space, the sooner will you become almost like the Wikipedia, if you will, of a company. People will come to you and say, hey, I'm trying to do this. Can you help me find the right supplier or suppliers? Or do you know where whatever commodity is going? Or are you able to help me project out what the next 3 to 5 years are going to look like for whatever service or solution that you're looking at? And so the sooner people are opening up on their strategy, the more you are able to help drive that and accelerate that and have that seat at the table from an innovation standpoint. And then the second thing is having really good strategic relationship with your suppliers, right? We often think internal. No, we also need to think external. The amount of innovation that suppliers drive today is staggering. And what better way would there be for procurement to be playing a role in that than for suppliers to come to me and say, hey, I'm about to do whatever, and are you willing to be the first customer? And we're willing to co-collaborate with you. I mean, you could go really wild with that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for procurement to drive, but it all starts with having a trusted relationship with both internal and external stakeholders.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone for submitting your questions. We do have related resources that we will be emailing to you as well related to today's topic. So we encourage you to peruse through those. We also encourage you to contact us, both Michael and Marisa. And I'd like to take this time to ask you to please visit our social media channels to stay up to date with everything happening at APQC. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Michael and Marisa. That was great information. And again, everyone will receive their slides within a follow-up email, as well as a copy of the recording within a few days. So thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Michael.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Hope it was informative. Thank you. Have a great day.
It was incredibly informative. Thank you, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.